welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to jump into a really fascinating and honestly pretty intense debate from an atheist call-in show. We're going to hear from two different callers who bring two completely different arguments for why they believe in God. Our job is to break down their arguments, see how the hosts respond, and really dig into what this whole clash tells us about proof, faith, and where we get our morality from. So, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the simple challenge the hosts lay down right at the start. Then, we'll dive into the first caller's argument, which is all about a dramatic personal experience. After that, we'll get into the second caller's much more philosophical case about objective morality. And finally, we'll see how the hosts try to dismantle that argument, which all leads up to this one, single, jaw-dropping question that the caller just can't answer. Okay, so let's get right into it. The whole conversation, everything that follows, really hangs on this one single challenge that the hosts put out there. This is basically the rule book for the entire debate. And there it is, simple, direct. The hosts are drawing a line in the sand. They're saying, look, we're not here to talk about your personal faith or your feelings. We need something we can actually look at, either evidence we can verify or an argument that's logically solid. This is the bar that both callers are going to have to try and clear. First up to the plate is a caller named Robert. And his proof isn't some ancient text or a complicated philosophical idea. Nope, it's his own personal story. This is what you'd call the argument from experience, and it's a really common one you'll hear in these kinds of discussions. You have to understand, for Robert, this event was as real as anything. He describes this burning feeling on his hand, a voice that he believes was God speaking directly to him. And he doesn't just see this as a weird, unexplainable thing. He connects it straight to the Bible, to the mark of the beast. So for him, this is undeniable proof that God and Satan are real, active forces in the world. But the hosts push back on this immediately. They categorize Robert's entire story as anecdotal evidence. And their point is pretty straightforward. No matter how powerful or real this experience felt to Robert, it all happened inside his own personal world. Nobody else can see it, test it, or verify it. So as compelling as it might be to him, it just doesn't meet their standard for evidence. A personal story isn't public proof. Okay, now this is where the conversation takes a really interesting turn. At one point, Robert just dismisses the theory of evolution, calling it garbage. He attacks this really common caricature of it, the whole monkeys turning into men idea. But instead of debating that straw man, the host does something brilliant. He asks a simple question: do genes exist? And Robert says, yes, of course. And that's the trap. The host then explains that the actual scientific definition of evolution is just a change in the frequency of gene variants in a population over time. So, by admitting that genes exist, Robert accidentally accepted the basic mechanism of the very theory he was trying to reject. It's just a perfect example of using precise definitions to show a flaw in an argument. All right, now we're going to switch gears completely. The second caller, Walter, comes in with a totally different approach. It's not a personal story, it's a big philosophical argument. He's using a version of the moral argument, which was famously championed by the writer C.S. Lewis. So the idea here is pretty simple when you break it down. It suggests that, no matter where you go in the world, people just seem to have this built-in sense of fairness, of right and wrong. They argue, they complain when they're treated unfairly, they appeal to some kind of standard. The argument then says, well, where did that standard come from? It must have been put inside us by a divine lawgiver, who we call God. But the hosts don't even bother arguing about whether a moral law exists. Instead, they do something much smarter. They take the caller's own logic and flip it right back on him. They ask this critical question: if God is the ultimate source of all morality, then doesn't that mean everything God does in the Bible has to be, by definition, a morally good thing? This one question is the key that's going to unlock their whole counterargument. And this, right here, is the host's signature move. It's what's called an internal critique. They don't bring in some outside philosophy book or scientific paper. They pick up the caller's own holy book and use it to test if his moral framework actually holds up. They go right to this passage in 2 Samuel. And the context is that, as a punishment for King David, the text says God himself will cause David's innocent wives to be publicly sexually assaulted. So the hosts just lay it out there as a direct challenge. Is this act, which the Bible attributes directly to God, an objectively moral one? And this kicks off a debate about one little word. The caller, Walter, tries to argue that God just allowed this to happen, but the host was ready for this. He points out that in the original Hebrew text, the verb used isn't just allowed. It's in a special form called the causative stem, which basically means God is taking direct credit for making it happen. And that's a huge problem for the caller. If God caused an act that any of us today would call monstrously evil, then how can God be the perfect, unchanging source of objective good? So this all builds up to the absolute climax of the entire debate. The caller's whole argument rests on an idea called divine command theory, which is basically that something is good just because God commands it. So the hosts decide to take that idea and push it to its absolute logical breaking point. They ask, is there anything so awful that it would still be wrong even if God commanded it? So to test this idea, the host presents this intentionally horrifying hypothetical. And he's careful to say, the point isn't that God would command this. The philosophical question is, if he did, would that terrible act suddenly become morally good simply because God was the one who ordered it? And faced with this impossible choice, Walter just shuts down. He calls it a non-question and refuses to answer. You see, he's caught in a logical trap. If he says no, that would still be evil. Then he's admitting morality is something separate from God. But he can't bring himself to say yes, it would be good, because, well, the act is just too monstrous to imagine. And this is the final, brilliant checkmate. The host, Jim, who claims to have subjective morals, has zero problem answering instantly. He says, absolutely no way would it be good to do that. But the caller, Walter, who believes in an objective morality from God, is the one who's completely paralyzed by the question. He's trapped by the logic of his own position. So what this whole thing seems to reveal is a kind of moral double standard. In this system, it looks like certain actions, like causing death or causing sexual assault, are permissible for God, even though they're obviously immoral for human beings. And that seems to completely undermine the idea of a single, universal, objective moral law. And that's really the big, provocative question we're left with at the end of all this. If your moral system forces you to even hesitate for a second before condemning an absolutely horrific act, then what is that system really worth? By dissecting these arguments from personal testimony to grand philosophy, this exchange doesn't just challenge the callers, it really challenges all of us to take a hard look at our own beliefs and ask ourselves if our moral compass can still point true, even when it's pushed to the most terrifying extreme.